The Celts were people in Iron Age and medieval Europe who spoke Celtic languages and had cultural similarities, although the relationship between ethnic, linguistic and cultural factors in the Celtic world remains uncertain and controversial. The exact geographic spread of the ancient Celts is also disputed, in particular, the ways in which the Iron Age inhabitants of Great Britain and Ireland should be regarded as Celts has become a subject of controversy. The history of pre-Celtic Europe remains very uncertain. According to one theory, the common root of the Celtic languages, a language known as Proto Celtic, arose in the Late Bronze Age Urnfield culture of Central Europe, which flourished from around 1200 BC. In addition, according to a theory proposed in the 19th century, the first people to adopt cultural characteristics regarded as Celtic were the people of the Iron Age Hallstatt culture in Central Europe, named for the rich grave finds in Hallstatt, Austria. Thus this area is sometimes called the Celtic homeland. During the later Lateen period, this Celtic culture was supposed to have expanded by diffusion and migration to the British Isles, France and the Low Countries, Bohemia, Poland and much of Central Europe, the Iberian Peninsula and northern Italy and, following the Gallic invasion of the Balkans in 279 BC, as far east as central Anatolia. The earliest undisputed direct examples of a Celtic language are the Lepontic inscriptions, beginning in the 6th century BC. Continental Celtic languages are attested almost exclusively through inscriptions and place names. Insular Celtic is attested beginning around the 4th century AD through Opham inscriptions, although it was clearly being spoken much earlier. Celtic literary tradition begins with Old Irish texts around the 8th century. Coherent texts of early Irish literature, such as the Táin Bó Cúailnge, survive in 12th century recensions. By the mid-1st millennium AD, with the expansion of the Roman Empire and the great migrations of Germanic peoples, Celtic culture and Insular Celtic had become restricted to Ireland, the western and northern parts of Great Britain, the Isle of Man, and Brittany. Between the 5th and 8th centuries, the Celtic-speaking communities in these Atlantic regions emerged as a reasonably cohesive cultural entity. They had a common linguistic, religious, and artistic heritage that distinguished them from the culture of the surrounding polities. By the 6th century, however, the continental Celtic languages were no longer in wide use. Insular Celtic culture diversified into that of the Gaels and the Brythonic Celts of the medieval and modern periods. A modern, Celtic identity was constructed as part of the Romanticist Celtic revival in Great Britain, Ireland, and other European territories, such as Portugal and Spanish Galicia. Today, Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, and Breton are still spoken in parts of the historical territories. In Cornish and Manx are undergoing a revival. Names and terminology. The first recorded use of the name of Celts, as Kappa Epsilon Lambda Tau Omicron Iota to refer to an ethnic group, was by Archytas of Miletus, the Greek geographer, in 517 BC, when writing about a people living near Massilia. In the 5th century BC, Herodotus referred to Celtois living around the head of the Danube and also in the far west of Europe. The etymology of the term Celtois is unclear. Possible roots include Indo-European *kl, to hide, i.e. *kl, to heat, or *kel, to impel. Several authors have supposed it to be Celtic in origin, while others view it as a name coined by Greeks. Linguist Patricia de Bernardo Stempel falls in the latter group, and suggests the meaning, the tall ones. In the 1st century BC, Julius Caesar reported that the people known to the Romans as Gauls called themselves Celts, which suggests that even if the name Celtois was bestowed by the Greeks, it had been adopted to some extent as a a collective name by the tribes of Gaul. The geographer Strabo, writing about Gaul towards the end of the 1st century BC, refers to the race which is now called both Gallic and Galatic, though he also uses the term Celtica as a synonym for Gaul, which is separated from Iberia by the Pyrenees. Yet he reports Celtic peoples in Iberia, and also uses the ethnic names Celtiberi and Celtici for peoples there, as distinct from Lusitania and Iberi. Pliny the Elder cited the use of Celtici in Lusitania as a tribal surname, which epigraphic findings have confirmed. Latin Gallus might stem from a Celtic ethnic tribal name originally, perhaps one borrowed into Latin during the Celtic expansions into Italy during the early 5th century BC. Its root may be the common Celtic *galno, meaning power, strength, hence Old Irish gal, boldness, ferocity, and Welsh gallu, to be able, power. The tribal names of Gallici and the Greek gamma alpha lambda alpha tau alpha iota most probably have the same origin. The suffix -ati might be an ancient Greek inflection. Classical writers did not apply the terms kappa epsilon lambda tau omicron iota or celta to the inhabitants of Britain or Ireland, which has led to some scholars preferring not to use the term for the Iron Age inhabitants of those islands. Celt is a modern English word, first attested in 1707, in the writing of Edward Lhuyd, whose work, along with that of other late 17th century scholars, brought academic attention to the languages and history of the early Celtic inhabitants of Great Britain. The English form Gaul and Gaulish come from the French Gaul and Gaulois, a borrowing from Frankish *Walholand, land of foreigners or Romans, the root of which is Proto-Germanic *Wala, foreigner, or Celt, whence the English word Welsh, South German Welsh, meaning Celtic speaker, French speaker, or Italian speaker, in different contexts, and Old Norse vals ki, place valia, Gaulish, French. Proto-Germanic *Wala is derived ultimately from the name of the Volcae, a Celtic tribe who lived first in the south of Germany and emigrated then to Gaul. This means that English Gaul, despite its superficial similarity, is not actually derived from Latin Galliae, though it does refer to same ancient region. Celtic refers to a family of languages and, more generally, means of the Celts, or in the style of the Celts. Several archaeological cultures are considered Celtic in nature, based on unique sets of artifacts. The link between language and artifact is aided by the presence of inscriptions. For other applications of the term, the relatively modern idea of an identifiable Celtic cultural identity or Celticity generally focuses on similarities among languages, works of art, and classical texts, and sometimes also among material artifacts, social organization, homeland and mythology. Earlier theories held that these similarities suggest a common racial origin for the various Celtic peoples, but more recent theories hold that they reflect a common cultural and language heritage more than a genetic one. Celtic cultures seem to have been widely diverse, with the use of a Celtic language being the main thing they have in common. Today, the term Celtic generally refers to the languages and respective cultures of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, the Isle of Man, and Brittany, also known as the Celtic nations. These are the regions where four Celtic languages are still spoken to some extent as mother tongues. The four are Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, and Breton, plus two recent revivals, Cornish and Manx. There are also attempts to reconstruct the Cumbric language. Celtic regions of continental Europe are those whose residents claim a Celtic heritage, but where no Celtic language has survived. These areas include the Western Iberian Peninsula, e. Portugal, and north-central Spain. Continental Celts are the Celtic-speaking people of mainland Europe, and insular Celts are the Celtic-speaking peoples of the British and Irish Islands and their descendants. The Celts of Brittany derive the language from migrating insular Celts, mainly from Wales and Cornwall, and so are grouped accordingly. Origins. The Celtic languages form a branch of the larger Indo-European family. By the time speakers of Celtic languages enter history around 400 BC, they were already split into several language groups, and spread over much of western continental Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, Ireland and Britain. Some scholars think that the Urnfield culture of Western Middle Europe represents an origin for the Celts as a distinct cultural branch of the Indo-European family. This culture was preeminent in Central Europe during the Late Bronze Age, from c. 1200 BC until 700 BC, itself following the Unetice and tumulus cultures. The Urnfield period saw a dramatic increase in population in the region, probably due to innovations in technology and agricultural practices. The Greek historian Ephorus of Syme in Asia Minor, writing in the 4th century BC, believed that the Celts came from the islands off the mouth of the Rhine and were driven from their homes by the frequency of wars and the violent rising of the sea. The spread of ironworking led to the development of the Hallstatt culture directly from the Urnfield. Proto Celtic, the latest common ancestor of all known Celtic languages, is considered by this school of thought to have been spoken at the time of the late Urnfield or early Hallstatt cultures. In the early 1st millennium BC, the spread of the Celtic languages to Iberia, Ireland and Britain would have occurred during the first half of the 1st millennium BC. The earliest chariot burials in Britain dating to c. 500 BC. Other scholars see Celtic languages as covering Britain and Ireland, and parts of the continent, long before any evidence of Celtic culture is found in archaeology. Over the centuries the language developed into the separate Celtiberian, Goidelic, and Brythonic languages. The Hallstatt culture was succeeded by the Lateen culture of Central Europe, which was overrun by the Roman Empire, though traces of Lateen style are still to be seen in Gallo-Roman artifacts. In Britain and Ireland, Lateen style in art survived precariously to re-emerge in insular art. Early Irish literature casts light on the flavour and tradition of the heroic warrior elites who dominated Celtic societies. Celtic river names are found in great numbers around the upper reaches of the Danube and Rhine, which led many Celtic scholars to place the ethnogenesis of the Celts in this area. Diodorus Siculus and Strabo both suggest that the heartland of the people they called Celts was in southern France. The former says that the Gauls were to the north of the Celts, but that the Romans referred to both as Gauls. Before the discoveries at Hallstatt and Lateen, it was generally considered that the Celtic heartland was southern France. See Encyclopaedia Britannica for 1813. Linguistic evidence. The Proto-Celtic language is usually dated to the Late Bronze Age. The earliest records of a Celtic language are the Lepontic inscriptions of Cisalpine Gaul, the oldest of which still predate the Lateen period. Other early inscriptions, appearing from the early Lateen period in the area of Massilia, are in Gaulish, which was written in the Greek alphabet until the Roman conquest. Celtiberian inscriptions, using their own Iberian script, appear later, after about 200 BC. Evidence of insular Celtic is available only from about 400 AD, in the form of primitive Irish Ogham inscriptions. Besides epigraphical evidence, an important source of information on early Celtic is toponymy. Archaeological evidence. Before the 19th century, scholars assumed that the original land of the Celts was west of the Rhine. Rhine, more precisely in Gaul, because it was where Greek and Roman ancient sources, namely Caesar, located the Celts. This view was challenged by the 19th-century historian Marie-Henri d'Arbois de Jubenville, who placed the land of origin of the Celts east of the Rhine. Jubenville based his arguments on a phrase of Herodotus that placed the Celts at the source of the Danube, and argued that Herodotus had meant to place the Celtic homeland in southern Germany. The finding of the prehistoric cemetery of Hallstatt in 1846 by Johann Ramsauer and the finding of the archaeological site of Lateen by Hans Lecoq in 1857 drew attention to this area. The concept that the Hallstatt and Lateen cultures could be seen not just as chronological periods but as culture groups, entities composed of people of the same ethnicity and language, had started to grow by the end of the 19th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, the belief that these culture groups could be thought of in racial or ethnic terms was strongly held by Gordon Childe, whose theory was influenced by the writings of Gustav Cassina. As the 20th century progressed, the racial ethnic interpretation of Lateen culture became much more strongly rooted, and any findings of Lateen culture and flat inhumation cemeteries were directly associated with the Celts and the Celtic language. The Iron Age Hallstatt and Lateen cultures are typically associated with Proto-Celtic and Celtic culture. In various academic disciplines, the Celts were considered a Central European Iron Age phenomenon, through the cultures of Hallstatt and Lateen. However, archaeological finds from the Hallstatt and Lateen culture were rare in the Iberian Peninsula, in southwestern France, northern and western Britain, southern Ireland and Galatia, and did not provide enough evidence for a cultural scenario comparable to that of Central Europe. It is considered equally difficult to maintain that the origin of the Peninsular Celts can be linked to the preceding Urnfield culture. This has resulted in a more recent approach that introduces a Proto-Celtic substratum in a process of Celticization, having its initial roots in the Bronze Age Bell-Beaker culture. The Lateen culture developed and flourished during the Late Iron Age in eastern France, Switzerland, Austria, southwest Germany, the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary. It developed out of the Hallstatt culture without any definite cultural break, under the impetus of considerable Mediterranean influence from Greek, and later Etruscan civilizations. A shift of settlement centers took place in the 4th century. The Western Lateen culture corresponds to historical Celtic Gaul. Whether this means that the whole of Lateen culture can be attributed to a unified Celtic people is difficult to assess. Archaeologists have repeatedly concluded that language, material culture, and political affiliation do not necessarily run parallel. Frey notes that in the 5th century, burial customs in the Celtic world were not uniform, rather, localized groups had their own beliefs, which, in consequence, also gave rise to distinct artistic expressions. Thus, while the Lateen culture is certainly associated with the Gauls, the presence of Lateen artifacts may be due to cultural contact and does not imply the permanent presence of Celtic speakers. Historical evidence. Polybius published a history of Rome about 150 BC in which he describes the Gauls of Italy and their conflict with Rome. Pausanias in the 2nd century AD says that the Gauls, originally called Celts, live on the remotest region of Europe on the coast of an enormous tidal sea. Posidonius described the southern Gauls about 100 BC. Though his original work is lost, it was used by later writers such as Strabo. The latter, writing in the early 1st century AD, deals with Britain and Gaul as well as Hispania, Italy and Galatia. Caesar wrote extensively about his Gallic wars in 58-51 BC. Diodorus Siculus wrote about the Celts of Gaul and Britain in his first-century history. Minority views. Miles Dillon and Nora Kershaw Chadwick accepted that the Celtic settlement of the British Isles might have to be dated to the Beaker period, concluding that there is no reason why so early a date for the coming of the Celts should be impossible. Martin Almagro Gorby proposed the origins of the Celts could be traced back to the 3rd millennium BC, seeking the initial roots in the Bell-Beaker culture, thus offering the wide dispersion of the Celts throughout Western Europe, as well as the variability of the different Celtic peoples, and the existence of ancestral traditions and ancient perspective. Using a multidisciplinary approach, Alberto J. Lorio and Gonzalo Ruiz Zapatero reviewed and built on Almagro Gorby's work to present a model for the origin of the Celtic archaeological groups in the Iberian Peninsula, and proposing a rethinking the meaning of Celtic from a European perspective. More recently, John Koch and Barry Cunliffe have suggested that Celtic origins lie with the Atlantic Bronze Age, roughly contemporaneous with the Hallstatt culture but positioned considerably to the west, extending along the Atlantic coast of Europe. Stephen Oppenheimer points out that the only written evidence that locates the Celtwar near the source of the Danube is in the histories of Herodotus. However, Oppenheimer shows that Herodotus seemed to believe the Danube rose near the Pyrenees, which would place the ancient Celts in a region which is more in agreement with later classical writers and historians.